So last month, we talked mainly about the resurgence of the aviation industry in the late 1920s and how much the Edmonton Flying Club and just flying clubs across the country greatly helped with the resurgence in aviation in the late 1920s. The Edmonton and Northern Alberta Aero Club was very, very busy in its first year. They had 1,224 flights with about 324 hours of training. Of that, 65 hours and 40 minutes were solo, and 12 hours and 5 minutes were carrying passengers. So 4 people graduate in the first year: Art Rankin, Alex Clark, Russ Brinkman, and R.P. Owen. Of those, Rankin and Clark had a pretty long and distinguished career with Trans-Canada Airlines, and the others I don't really know much about. The club generally had a vested interest in graduating pilots. The club earned $100 from the federal government for every pilot that they graduated. Not that they would bend the rules and force pilots force people to graduate if they weren't qualified, but it definitely helped keep the club going, helped maintain their aircraft, and because the club was also responsible for the overall operations and maintenance of the entire airport, it helped out quite a bit. So with the meeting forming the flying club at the McDonald Hotel, Watt May then became the chief instructor, and Charles Becker, or Cy Becker, was the club president. And in 1928, there's 130 new aircraft that are registered in Canada, which is more than all previous years combined. So it was truly a banner year for aviation in Canada. Jumping outside of Edmonton, James Armstrong Richardson was born in Kingston, Ontario, and after university he joined his family business, which was James Richardson and Sons Limited, in Winnipeg, which was heavily involved in its expansion from 1918 to 1939. The company was primarily dealing with Canada's grain industry, but he had a lot of other interests, including mining. And this interest in expanding his mining interests, especially in Ontario, led him to develop an interest in aviation in general. So as such, he formed Western Canada Airways Limited in 1926 with Harold Anthony, or Doc Oakes, as his first manager. It was based in Hudson, Ontario. In 1927, they were very heavily involved in this huge, massive expedition to Churchill, from Cache Lake, Manitoba to Fort Churchill, including 14 passengers and 30 tons of supplies and equipment in 1 month using the Fokker Universal. We talked about the Fokker Universal a little bit last month in this expedition last month, but this Churchill airlift was by far the biggest operation in Canada in commercial aviation at the time, and it really paved the way for bush flying in general and just the expansion of commercial activities that relied on aviation in Canada. Richardson didn't stop there. He became a director of Fairchild Aerial Surveys, a director of Canadian Vickers Limited, a director of Northern Aerial Mineral Explorations, or NAME, the Aviation Corporation of Delaware, who controlled other American aircraft companies. And so he had his hands in a lot of pots. Western Canada Airways expanded pretty rapidly, but in general, Canada lagged quite a bit behind the United States in terms of our airline industry and aircraft industry. And Richardson was pretty worried about American intervention in Canada and the American takeover of small Canadian aviation interests. So we had an idea to amalgamate a lot of these smaller companies and make a larger company that could compete with these larger American companies. The last time we talked about Punch Dickins, he was opening up Blatchford Field in 1927 with a flight of Armstrong Whitworth Siskins up from high level. So in 1928, Punch Dickins is now a pilot with Western Canada Airways. He's on leave from the RCAF. And one of his early flights is from Baker Lake to Stony Rapids at Lake Athabasca, which is a distance of about 1,100 kilometers. What's the big deal with this flight? Up until now, most of the flights, especially in the Arctic, have been along pretty well-established trade routes. So flying up to Norman Wells, for instance, following the Mackenzie River, along the way there was a lot of settlements and forts, fur traders and indigenous groups that lived there, and so they knew the terrain already. They knew what to expect flying down the Mackenzie. Flying across the Northwest Territories, or Nunavut, or what they were calling the Barrens at the time, was entirely new. They didn't have any maps. Their compasses were not accurate, so they were flying with dead reckoning, which is a pretty new concept at the time. And so Punch Dickins flies on this huge prospecting tour of the Northwest Territories organized by Charles McAlpine, who was a mining magnate for Dominion Explorers out of Toronto. So Dickins is chosen as the pilot. They're using Western Canada Airways' new Fokker Super Universal equipped with floats. And Northern Canada, of course, has thousands and thousands and thousands of lakes, and at the time, no runways. So a float plane is pretty important for flying up north in the summertime. And a year after this Churchill airlift, this is setting new records as like a very new and very ambitious flight in Canada. And it's arguably what makes Punch Dickins famous, and it earns him the McKee Trophy for 1928. So it's a flight of about 6,400 kilometers over the Barren Lands between Hudson's Bay and Mackenzie River Basin. So pretty much none of it had been mapped before, and that terrain is fairly featureless. There's no trees, just a lot of barren rocks and lakes, so it's pretty difficult flying. This flight, they left Winnipeg, they flew to Fort Churchill, up the west coast of the Hudson's Bay, to Chesterfield Inlet, inland to Baker Lake, and then southwest to Stony Rapids, and returning to Winnipeg. So for about 6,400 kilometers. After Fort Churchill, they didn't have any radio communication, so they were navigating by way of the sun. As I mentioned, the magnetic compass is not reliable up north because they're too close to the magnetic pole. So we averaged about 330 miles per day on this quest, but if that only if that discounts the days that they had to tie down with the passage of bad weather, which they had to do quite a bit. When he was actually flying, he was up for about 5 hours at a time, and he carried extra fuel with him in the cargo compartment of the aircraft. He also had an engineer with him, Bill Naden, who did all of the maintenance on the trip. And with a cruise speed of about 160 kilometers an hour, his 12-day journey involved more than 40 hours of flying time, and a lot of that was due to Bill Naden's successful maintenance on this Fokker Super Universal. So for all intents and purposes in the 1920s, this is kind of equivalent to flying to the moon and back. It's completely unknown territory. They are out there on their own with very little supplies and very little backup in case something goes wrong. And the picture here is Punch Dickins on a dock with his dog, and he's standing next to the Fokker Super Universal. This aircraft was painted blue and yellow, and the only major difficulty they had was they were forced down because of low fuel, but luckily a steamship was nearby and was able to get them new fuel. We talked about the Fokker Universal a bit last week, or the Fokker Atlantic Model 4. Especially in regards to the Hudson's Bay expedition. So the Canadian government bought a bunch of Fokker Universals and used them to map the ice flows in the Hudson's Bay. So that particular aircraft was really designed, it was an American aircraft, it was designed as a small airliner, it was designed to operate on built runways, but Western Canada Airways purchased Fokker Universals. They did find it generally robust and reliable. It could operate in the bush, as it was proven in the Hudson's Bay expedition, and it could operate in winter conditions, but ultimately it proved not quite reliable enough and not quite good enough of a bush plane for their purposes. The landing gear of the Universal was particularly prone to failure in the wintertime. The skis had a lot less cushioning than wheels, and so Western Canada ultimately had a lot of issues with their Universals. So Fokker Atlantic, in conjunction with Western Canada Airways, redesigned the Universal based on this feedback. So they developed the Super Universal, which was a much more successful bush plane. So rather than an open cockpit, the Universal has an enclosed cockpit. The roof is actually a door, so it's much more comfortable for the pilot. And also, they redesigned a lot of the features of the aircraft to be more convenient to pilots. So the crankshaft to manually crank the engine on the Universal was on the side of the aircraft. So you couldn't do that from the cockpit. In the Universal, they put it at the very top of the cockpit. So you could open up the roof doors, lean out, and then manually crank the engine. The control wires were all quite a bit overbuilt. They're all outside the aircraft for easy maintenance. They beefed up the landing gear. The shock absorbers were made from bungee cords, which were prone to snapping when it was particularly cold, but they were very, very easy to change. So ultimately, they made it rugged and reliable. They knew where it was going to break, and they made those particular aspects of the aircraft easy to fix when it did break. So the Super Universal, could carry about 225 kilograms of cargo with a full fuel load and a pilot, and it was powered by a Pratt & Whitney Wasp B of about 450 horsepower. And it had pretty good range of about 1,100 kilometers. With a capacity of about 355 liters of fuel, so about 35 liters per 100 kilometers, which is about 5 times worse than my 2009 Toyota Yaris. But when you consider that it's a very large 1920s bush plane, it's actually pretty decent. So the Super Universal essentially turned out to be the perfect bush plane for the Canadian North in the late 1920s and early 30s. So the Fokker Super Universal also was selected by numerous other explorers, including Admiral Byrd, for his Antarctic expedition in 1928. So here's a couple photos of some of their Super Universals. In this particular shack, some people have seen this photo and asked me if this aircraft has crashed into the shack. Well, it's actually a nose hangar, so the engine can sit inside the hangar, and they can work on the engine, warm it up, and warm the oil up. They built these little shacks all over to help service their aircraft. These photos are a little bit later, but they show just how easy it is to work on the Super Universal. But it also shows you how much the pilots had to kind of innovate. So here they are changing from wheels to skis, and they've just braced the wing on a bunch of barrels that are stacked up. You can see the enclosed cockpit behind. In the Universal, it also had an enclosed cockpit, so the passengers are comfortable, but it was a bit miserable for the pilots. In November of 1928, Western Canada Airways won the contract to carry mail on the Prairie Circuit from Winnipeg, Regina, Calgary, Edmonton, Saskatoon, and then back to Winnipeg. And Punch Dickins made the first airmail flight in a Fokker Super Universal. It was pretty successful within a few months, and then airmail service became a regular feature. And they ended up using a different aircraft, which is the Fokker F-14, which is what's pictured here. Back in Edmonton, with the flying club very successful and aviation picking up across Canada, Watmay decides that he wants to go back into commercial aviation. So he partners with one of the students from the flying club, Vic Horner, who's a fellow World War I vet. Horner was in the Army throughout the war, so he's only just learning to fly now. But Horner's mother-in-law, Mrs. Angela Lee, who is not related to me, whose husband, Robert Lee, who was not a Civil War general, was the mayor of Edmonton in 1909 and 1910, and she's the one that finances the company. So Watmay at this time has been selling cash registers. Vic Horner has been selling Model A Fords. So they bring in Cy Becker, who's a pilot and a lawyer, and form Commercial Airways. The first aircraft is the Avro Avian. And the Avian is a series of British light aircraft built by Avro in the 1920s and 1930s, and it's pretty similar to the de Havilland Moth. It's slightly smaller. They're both powered by the ADC Cirrus, so it's a 4-cylinder air-cooled engine. Ultimately, the Avian is a capable aircraft, but it was vastly outsold by the Moth. And the Moth was really designed for flying clubs, and that really helped the Moth become much more successful. Another famous Avian was owned by Lady Mary Heath and Amelia Earhart. And that particular aircraft was used by Earhart on her first long solo flight in August of 1928. So she became the first woman to fly solo across North America and back. And that's her with her Avian. Some other early Avian flights. Commercial Airways is contracted by the Rialto Theatre here in Edmonton. The reels for the film Hangman's House are basically held up on the train in Strome, Alberta. So they panic and they hire Watmay to fly to Strome and pick up the reels for this film so they can bring it back and have a successful opening night. And Glenn Ruby, who's the manager of the Hudson's Bay Marland Oil Company, hires Watmay to take him on a tour of the Viking oil field. So it starts to show that this commercial aviation is picking up. Earlier, in the early 20s, there was really not a lot of opportunities, and mainly it was kind of joyriding and barnstorming. And this Glenn Ruby flight of touring the oil fields really helps or shows what bush pilots are going to be doing, which is essentially a lot of exploration work, especially for natural gas resources. Lee Britnell, the last time we talked about Lee Britnell, he had been a Royal Flying Corps instructor in Canada, and he also served as a Royal Flying Corps instructor in Fort Worth, Texas during the First World War. He spent the early 20s in the United States flying Curtiss JN-4 Jennies, and then he joined the Ontario Provincial Air Service in 1924. So Western Canada Airways hires him in 1927, and he's a very successful pilot for them, and they hire him on as a regional manager as well. So he ends up pioneering a lot of Western Canada's routes. He's the first one to fly a return flight from Winnipeg to Vancouver in a multi-engine aircraft. And in 1929, he's a pilot and manager for Western Canada Airways, and he flies a 14,400 kilometer return flight in a Fokker trimotor, inspecting all of Western Canada Airways bases from Winnipeg up through the Northwest Territories, the Mackenzie River Basin, Yukon, northern British Columbia, and Edmonton before returning to Winnipeg. So the photo in the top right is Lee Britnell from World War I, and the second is Western Canada Airways Fokker triplane. So it's very similar to the other Fokkers with an engine up front and then two extra engines hung off the wings. So larger aircraft can carry more cargo and carry more people. So in Edmonton, aviation is starting to pick up. The Flying Club is the chief operator at Blatchford Field. They're starting to realize the limits of what the city had built only a year ago with the opening of the airport. Commercial airways is starting to take over. Airmail service is starting up across the provinces. Aircraft are coming in from Western Canada. And so some people in the city decide that, you know what, we really need to upgrade this airport in order to keep Edmonton essentially on the map. And most especially, they want a decent hangar. So during the 1928 civic election, there's a question on the ballot. Should the city spend $23,860 to develop an out-of-date airport? So build proper hangars, properly graded runways, etc. So it goes to a vote, and unfortunately, 38% vote no, which is enough to defeat the motion. It's the only motion that is defeated. So they decide that they need to spend money on paving, grading, hospital, remodeling the fire hall, fire department equipment, which of course is all valuable stuff, but this airport, it's too much. So if you're a little bit familiar with Edmonton's or Alberta's aviation history, you probably think, what's happening next. Another famous story concerning Wat May and Vic Horner and the Avro Avian. But we need to talk about a different epidemic first. So this article speaks about how different epidemics were handled in Canada, because this isn't dealing with the famous diphtheria outbreak that claimed the life of one person in Fort Vermillion. This is actually a flu epidemic in 1928 that claimed the lives of hundreds of Indigenous people in northern Canada. So during the summer of 1928, a Hudson's Bay Company supply ship, the SS Distributor, took its annual trip down the Mackenzie River and unwittingly transmitted a pretty nasty form of influenza to the local Dene and Inuit populations. So this article is in regards to this flu. So the flu epidemic under control, declares Chief Indian Inspector. The sending of airplanes into the far north with supplies to fight the flu epidemic is not necessary. The dread malady which has taken the lives of over 300 natives now being under control, states Charles Parker of Ottawa, Chief Inspector, yada yada. Referring to the proposal from Calgary to send machines into the north, Mr. Parker points out that there are no available places for machines to make landings except on water. He also says that the epidemic is quite clearly under control, heroic work having been done by the sisters, doctors, and nurses in that territory. And while the natives are in a weakened condition, it is not probable that there will be any more deaths from the disease itself. They're not prepared for winter. So then it goes on to say that the Indigenous population in the north is in particularly bad straits because they have not been able to hunt and fish as much. But ultimately they're saying, you know what? Taking aircraft to the north to help people in the north is way too much work and way too difficult. It also goes on to say that there was 313 Indigenous people that were killed and one white man, and then they of course name that particular white man and all of his details. So it's pretty clear that they don't really care about this particular epidemic. This epidemic is estimated to have killed between 10 and 15% of the indigenous people in the Northwest Territories in 1928. In the larger settlements that had Hudson's Bay posts or RCMP detachments or large religious institutions, they definitely had more nurses and the death toll wasn't as bad. But in remote communities, they were hit particularly hard. So this article is from the 18th of August, 1928, and then only 5 months later, we have a different story. So in northern Alberta, there's a fur trader named Albert Logan, who's a Hudson's Bay employee, and he's posted to Little Red River near Fort Vermillion, and he'd recently returned from a holiday in Quebec. He's unpacking his suitcase, and he suddenly falls particularly ill. His wife was a nurse, and she recognized the symptoms pretty clearly as diphtheria, which is an illness caused by a poison secreted by a bacterial infection. So it causes labored breathing, heart failure, paralysis, and death. So she sends for help right away. She finds a local family to go to Fort Vermillion and ask for Dr. Harold Hammond to come. So he arrives by dog team a week later, but there isn't really anything that can be done for her husband. But he recognizes that, yes, the risk of the diphtheria outbreak is particularly high, and he needed to act fast in order to get everybody in Fort Vermillion and Little Red River inoculated as soon as possible. So they organize a horse and dog team led by Willie Lambert and Joe Lafleur, who mush 530 kilometers south over 12 days in brutally cold temperatures of minus 40 Celsius to the telegraph office at Peace River to telegraph back to Edmonton. Diphtheria, fear epidemic, send antitoxin. So the Ministry of Health officials, especially the Deputy Minister, who's Dr. Malcolm Bowe, act pretty quickly. So they start preparing enough diphtheria antitoxin to treat 200 cases. But getting that medicine up to Little Red River was a challenge given the winter months. The fastest option was to fly. But it was a particularly dangerous journey in the middle of wintertime, and they needed a very skilled pilot. Somebody that was willing to risk their own health and safety in order to get this done. And there's only one person in Edmonton at the time that can do this, and that's Wat May. Unfortunately, Wat May is actually in Calgary at this time. So Horner calls him up, and they talk about it. May says, okay, get the Avian ready. We're going to leave tomorrow. So Wat May and Vic Horner have this Avro Avian. It's an open cockpit aircraft. It's got a small engine and no landing skis. So it's particularly ill-suited for winter operations. But they are the only game in town. So they agree to take the 600,000 units of diphtheria antitoxin to Fort Vermillion, where it's then transported by dog sled to Little Red River. They know that they can get there. They know that there's gasoline there, so they know they'll be able to get home. But flying that distance in an open biplane in January in Alberta is going to be pretty miserable. On January 2nd, 1929, about 12:45, they take off from Blatchford Field in Edmonton and head north. Temperature at the time is minus 28 on the ground, and definitely colder in the air. There's pretty nasty wind, low ceiling, and plenty of ice fog. They dressed as warmly as they could, and they had the antitoxin delivered from Mayor Bury, wrapped in woolen blankets with a small charcoal heater to keep it from freezing, because it's particularly important that you do not freeze this antitoxin or it'll be destroyed. So they have the small charcoal heater that they're keeping inside their open cockpit biplane, wrapped in wool blankets. And after only a short time in the air, they run into some difficulties because the heater had set the blankets on fire. So they have to make an emergency landing. They throw the blankets and heater away, but they know that they don't really have an option. They need to get this antitoxin. So they stuff the antitoxin under their armpits, in their underpants, anywhere under their clothes that'll keep it warm enough, and they take off once more and head north. Darkness, looming snowstorm forced them to land at McLennan, where health authorities had wired ahead to have a landing strip prepared. So they spent the night there, and they left the next morning as soon as it was light enough, about 9:40, and traveled 80 kilometers to Peace River, stopped to refuel the Avian, and then were on their way again. They followed the railway tracks and reached Fort Vermillion in the early afternoon, just when it was starting to get dark. The medicine was then sent by dog sled to Little Red River, and all the inhabitants of Fort Vermillion and Little Red River were inoculated against diphtheria. And there was only one casualty, who was the original patient zero, Bert Logan. On the way back, engine trouble and illness delayed their flight back to Edmonton, but when they got home, a crowd of 10,000 people gave Watmay and Vic Horner a pretty epic hero's welcome. They're frostbitten, they're cold, they're exhausted, but they make a full recovery. So these are some of the photos from their return voyage. So 6th of January 1929, there's a huge crowd at Blatchard Field. There's Mrs. Lee, who's the patron of commercial airways, Babe Horner, who's Vic Horner's wife, Watmay's mother, Vera, Vaimay, and Watmay. They look pretty tired. The story is very closely followed by Edmontonians. The Journal covered it extensively. People were glued to their radio sets to get word of this famous flight. So basically every day there was a story, and it also made international news. So this is a Associated Press article that I just randomly found from Reading, Pennsylvania, talking about the flight. So it was a particularly famous international story. By 1929, flying was getting underway in the north, and Punch Dickins happened to be in Fort McMurray in January of 1929, and he was getting ready to take off for some company business for Western Canada Airways for Fort Simpson with their Fokker F-14, which is this aircraft here. So the F-14 is another Fokker. The Fokker Universal that I talked about earlier has capacity for 4 passengers. It has a 220 horsepower engine, 33 feet long, 48 foot wingspan. Super Universal was bigger, could carry 6 people, a little bit bigger, and the Fokker F-14 was significantly bigger, but and newer than the two, but also significantly more obsolete, I should say. So at first glance, the 3 aircraft look pretty similar, but had some pretty notable differences. And the F-14 was really designed as a mail plane. So anyway, Punch Dickins is in Fort McMurray at the time, and due to a variety of causes like bad weather, a whole bunch of mail deliveries had piled up at Fort McMurray waiting ground transport. And they suggested that maybe Dickins could deliver the mail bags at various points between Fort McMurray and Fort Simpson. And so he said, actually, yes, this is an excellent opportunity, especially for Western Canada Airways. We can prove that we can take airmail to the north, and hopefully this will lead to a contract delivering a permanent contract delivering airmail. So the first airmail that went north by air was basically at last minute without any actual planning. And on his return from Fort Simpson, he flew out a very valuable cargo of furs from Fort Good Hope all the way to Edmonton over a distance of about 2,800 kilometers. And it's the first time that fur products had come out of the north by air. So it was a pretty pioneering flight. They also had pretty miserable conditions. It was minus 62 apparently when they left the fort. So yeah, it was a particularly difficult flight. When they land, they had to keep the engine warm, so they had to throw a canvas cover over the oil. They had to burn a blow pot under the oil all night and tend it to keep the oil warm enough and viscous enough so that they could start the engine the next day. And they started to really learn more and more about winter flying conditions up north. So after this, many assume that Western Canada Airways is going to get this permanent airmail contract, and they're going to be pretty surprised when they don't. So after this Mercy flight, Vic Horner and Watmay start realizing that they need something a little bit more capable than the Avian. So while the Avian was a capable aircraft, they really needed something that was better suited for year-round operation, could carry more cargo, carry more passengers. So Cy Becker sent the two down to California to pick up a brand new Lockheed Vega, which is a much, much more advanced aircraft. So the Vega's fuselage is built from sheets of plywood, and they're skinned over wooden ribs. So using a large concrete mold, they basically put a single half of the fuselage shell in this mold, and they blow up a big rubber bladder to expand the plywood in the mold, and then laminate the two pieces together. So it forms a particularly strong construction. And because of this essentially like toilet paper tube construction, it's a very solid shell, but they can't put the wing through that shell at this time. So they mount the wing very, very high up above the fuselage. This Avian doesn't have boots on the this Vega doesn't have boots on the wheels, but ultimately a lot of the design characteristics that go into the Vega are trying to make it as streamlined as possible. So the landing gear on this one is unstreamlined, but later versions of the Vega had teardrop-shaped fairings to make it much, much more aerodynamic. So it's doesn't have any external bracing for the wing, so it's very streamlined, a lot of very low drags. It's a very efficient aircraft, and it's very fast. Previous to this, the Avian and most of the aircraft we've talked about had essentially a truss system, either of wood or metal tubing, and then they're covered with fabric. They're strong, but they have generally a lot of problems with the fabric covering is very easy to damage, and the joints of the truss are prone to corrosion, and they're prone to a lot of problems. The monocoque construction, which is what the Vega is, and they start going into more and more, is transferring a lot of the load from the structure from that truss to the actual skin of the aircraft. And then a hybrid form of that is a semi-monocoque construction, where it's partially carried by the skin and also ribs and formers on the inside. So anyway, they fly home with the Vega. They stop in Vegas, Salt Lake City, Great Falls, and Calgary, and they return on February 10th to screaming fans. Even though they're not really doing anything other than picking up an aircraft in California, again, there's a huge crowd that greets them at the airport, and it's a big deal. And again, there's all sorts of newspaper articles that document this entire journey all the way from California. And once they get it back, all the newspapers remark that the Vega makes the Avian look like a toy. But now Commercial Airways has 2 aircraft, and they're starting to ramp up their operations. At this time, Cy Becker and Watt may get so busy with Commercial Airways that they're having trouble juggling their duties with the Aero Club. So they send off to England, and they hire Moss Burbage to be the chief instructor for the Aero Club, who happened to be the wartime commander of the club's vice president, Jimmy Bell. In early 1929, in the same year, Punch Dickins became the first pilot to fly the entire length of the Mackenzie River, so all 3,200 kilometers of it, in 2 days from Edmonton to Aklavik, becoming the first person to cross the Arctic Circle. In that same year, 2 privately chartered aircraft set off on an extremely lengthy flying tour into the eastern Arctic, financed by essentially mining interests under the leadership of Colonel CDH, or Cyril McAlpine. So Tommy Thompson flew ASP, which is a Fokker Super Universal leased from Western Canada Airways, for $1.75 per mile and $75 per day, with the intended trip being 32,187 kilometers, starting and ending in Winnipeg. It's like massively expensive expedition for Dominion Explorers Limited. The second aircraft is a Fairchild FC-2 AAO, owned by Dominion Explorers, and it's flown by Stan McMillan. This is the one that's actually carrying McAlpine. Mechanic Alec Milne and Brody Broadway, who's a Dominion Explorers mining engineer and spare pilot. So they achieved a bit of fame early on in this by delivering the first airmail to the eastern Arctic, but their expedition was fraught with a lot of problems. People warned them that their expedition was starting too late in the season, which was August of 1928, or 29 rather. They get to Churchill, Manitoba, and they're greeted with particularly bad news. The crew of the supply ship that had gone to Churchill arrives in a rowboat. They accidentally set it on fire and it sunk, so they arrive in their lifeboat. There's a nasty storm, and their Super Universal and Fairchild are swept out into the bay, and the Super Universal is lost. They manage to recover the Fairchild. So WCA flies a second Super Universal, which is ASK, up, and in September they head out for Chesterfield, which is about 360 kilometers northwest of Churchill. They hit inland for Baker Lake and then towards Bathurst Inlet, and are expected by the 9th of September. On the 24th of September, word arrives in Winnipeg that the expedition hasn't arrived and nobody has any idea where they are. So this triggers a massive search and rescue operation, which ends up involving more than 200 aircraft. Just absolutely massive undertaking in a very unknown part of Canada. Many famous bush pilots, early bush pilots, ended up taking part in this search, including Punch Dickins. So he and his engineer, W.S. Tall, covered 2,400 kilometers by air in their first attempt and another 7,000 kilometers in their second attempt, but weren't able to find the missing party of 8. Bad weather, lack of fuel forced the two planes to put down near Cambridge Bay at the first signs of habitation that they could find, which happened to be a small Inuit camp. The Inuit didn't speak English, and they didn't speak Inuktitut, but they were able to communicate enough that the Inuit sheltered them, fed them, and basically kept them alive until the temperature dropped low enough so that the ocean froze over and they could actually make the trek across the water to Cambridge Bay. So this massive air search lasted about 10 weeks and was only actually successful once the prospectors were brought by the Inuit to Cambridge Bay and then returned to Winnipeg in December of 1929 by Herbert Hollick Kenyon, who at the time was a bush pilot. He was flying for Western Canada Airways on the airmail circuit. After this, he ends up becoming an explorer, goes to Antarctica, then comes back to Edmonton, works for Canadian Airways, and gets a park named after him. So back in Edmonton, we have air travel really picking up across the provinces, and management of the municipal airport is proving to be particularly difficult. And the Flying Club is tasked with managing all of the operations of the entire airport, which is a really nice honor, but it's completely overwhelming for a volunteer organization. So ignore the hangar in the back of this photo that's kind of blocked off by this red mark. But this other hangar, which is the original shack built by Jock McNeil, is the only hangar at the airport. So they don't have a proper hangar. They don't have lights. There's a flight where an American named Parker Kramer, who happened to be the first man to fly from Siberia to New York, he flies into Edmonton with basically no notice on a flight to Alaska to prove and sell the early Cessna aircrafts. So he arrives at night. Members of the club see the aircraft in the air, and they try to light the landing strip with their car headlights, but they don't have any radio communication, and Kramer mistakes this as thinking that they're trying to point out the obstacles on the airfield. So he picks a likely dark patch, lands the aircraft, which hasn't been mowed properly. It's not the runway, and a tree rips a giant hole in the bottom of his aircraft. Luckily, the night before this, there was a small barn in that same patch, and it had burned to the ground. So he missed the burned barn and didn't suffer any further mishap. On another flight, a man from Winnipeg named John Morgan can't identify the field in the middle of daylight, and he just lands in a grain field instead and hits a telephone pole. So he completely wrecks his Avian, and he has to send it back to Winnipeg in a train car. So clearly the airport's falling behind. So next, there's a large, expensive Travel Air 6000, which is a 5-seat monoplane that arrives from Oklahoma, carrying oil tycoons, led by Grover Simpson of Tulsa. So he's the general manager of Laughlin Brothers Oil Company Limited, who, with E.R. Maisie from Calgary, who is the Alberta manager of their firm, and pilot Tip Sher, fly up to Edmonton en route to the Wainwright oil fields. And their landing is more than a little rocky when they arrive in Edmonton. So they publicly encouraged the city to upgrade the airport in advance of a huge number of aircraft that will be flying up from Oklahoma for the Calgary Stampede and then on to the Wainwright oil fields as oil and gas exploration starts ramping up in Alberta. So basically the quote at the end is, "A little money spent now would spread the word that Edmonton has a fine landing place. You have no idea how that message would bring visiting planes." It's also at this time that the Flying Club has their first serious accident. So one of their moths, ALB, stalls on takeoff and lands in the Calder Yards. This photo is actually their other moth, AKJ, which crashed in 1935 under pretty similar circumstances. But this prompts the city to start listening to the idea that actually we probably need to upgrade this airport. It's also inspired by the Mercy flight. So they realize that, hey, flying isn't just tooting around, having fun. We're starting to become known as a particularly important city on air routes, especially as a gateway to the north. So we really need to step up and do our part to make the airport better. So they don't bother to put it to a plebiscite this time. They figure, you know what, we're just going to spend the money. So the approval planned to spend $35,000 on airport improvements, including $14,000 for a new hangar, lighting for $11,400, and they get a subsidy from the federal government of $2,500, and utility extensions of $5,350. More importantly, they get to work fixing the field, removing the remaining tree roots and rocks, and making it much safer. So construction of the new hangar begins in November of 1929, and of course costs go up by the time the work is completed. So it ends up costing $27,763 to build the hangar, which, when you factor in for inflation, is about $408,000 in 2022 money. It's late 1929 when construction begins. It's after Black Tuesday, and people start getting worried about the costs, but thankfully they are able to get it done. So this is a early photo of the first hangar at Blatchford Field. If you look very closely, you can see a tractor. There's ACR, which is an Alexander Eagle Rock, which is a 1920s biplane by an American company. There's a Fokker Universal in the back. Some pretty interesting aircraft. So the hangar officially opens on February 1st of 1930. Jay Martland is the city architect. He designs the hangar. Carlson Construction Company was the one that's contracted to build it. So it's got a large central hall for the storage of aircraft, a machine shop, washrooms, storage facilities, and then offices in the tower. So the Flying Club occupies the main floor. The airport manager, Jimmy Bell, has the second floor, and then the third floor is a meteorological office with roof access. And then the very large windsock that's mounted to the roof is to tell pilots of local weather conditions. This photo is a little bit later, probably like 1936 or so. So I mentioned earlier that many people assumed that the airmail contract of the Arctic would be awarded to Western Canada Airways, but it ends up being awarded to Commercial Airways instead. So the tender for the airmail service closed in June of 1929, but isn't actually signed until November. The mail going north was carried to Waterways, which is in Wood Buffalo. It's now a neighborhood in Fort McMurray. And then Commercial Airways operated from Fort McMurray to carry the mail north. They get 3 new Belanca CH-300 pacemakers. They're cabin monoplanes, and they essentially purchased these 3 aircraft to inaugurate the run, in addition to their Lockheed Vega, and all 4 of them being ski-equipped. So the Vega is only really used as far north as Fort Simpson, and the Belancas are the ones that carry it all the way up to Aklavik. I'm getting a message that my internet connection is unstable, so is anybody having difficulty hearing or seeing my video? Okay. So this Belanca pacemaker ended up being Lot May's favorite aircraft. It's a 6-seat utility aircraft built in the United States. It's a development of the CH-200, fitted with a more powerful engine, and it is renowned for its long distance endurance and reliability. So in 1929, an American completed a nonstop flight from New York to Cuba in 13 hours in a pacemaker. In 1931, a pacemaker fitted with a diesel engine set a record for staying aloft for 84 hours and 33 minutes without being refueled, and that record stood for 55 years. In Alaska and the Canadian bush, Belancas were super popular aircraft. Canadian-operated Belancas were imported from the United States and then licensed built by Canadian Vickers in Montreal. The RCAF also operated them mainly for aerial photography. So the huge bulk of mail that was going north made it necessary to fly the bags in and out in relays to and from their various destinations. So the start from Fort McMurray over the 2,600 kilometer route this first flight began on December 10th of 1929 and took 17 days to fly it all in. On Christmas Day at Fort Simpson, they recorded a temperature apparently of minus 51 degrees Celsius, or about minus 60 Fahrenheit. And on Boxing Day, it was a balmy minus 42 Celsius. So pretty awful. The engineers had to absolutely stand on their heads, keeping the engines running throughout the night. There was very little facilities to shelter the aircraft. They only had blowtorches and fire pots to warm the engines if needed. So from December 10th to the 20th, mail was carried to communities in northern Alberta, so Fort Chip, Fort Fitzgerald, and the South Mackenzie District. Fort Smith, Fort Resolution, Hay River, Fort Providence and Fort Simpson. And then on December 21st, 2 planes left Fort Simpson and flew all the way up to, or wanted to go fly all the way up to Aklavik, but had to turn around because of particularly nasty weather. Eventually, they are able to get up to Aklavik and then carry a bunch of mail and supplies back from Aklavik all the way south through those various communities, back to Fort McMurray, and then back on to Edmonton. So the return flight starts at the end of the year, December 30th, and they get back to Edmonton on January 3rd of 1930, and of course are welcomed by a huge crowd of people. So here we've got, back in Edmonton, Ted Watt from the Edmonton Journal, G.H. Rock is the postmaster from Fort McMurray, Tim Sims is commercial airways mechanic, Cy Becker is the manager, Walter Hale is the postmaster, Father Leger is post office superintendent, May pilot, and Isaac Soloway financed commercial airways. So during the splits, 125 flights in 4 aircraft with 6 pilots flew for 181 hours, covering about 10,000 kilometers. The letter mail accounted for about 1,270 pounds, over 120,000 envelopes, and the commercial mail was 7,677 pounds, including parcel post. The total cost for these flights to December 31st, 1929 was $7,500 for 2 months of service, plus an additional $2,700 at a rate of 54 cents per mile for extra trips for regular letter mail. So they ended up netting $10,203 in this 2-week stint, which is about $168,000 in today's money. Pretty lucrative business. And the schedule here shows the rates for passenger and express mail per pound from Commercial Airways hub in Fort McMurray. So from Fort McMurray to Aklavik cost $410 per passenger and $2.70 per pound for freight. Put that into perspective, something that cost $410 in 1929 is about $6,750 in 2022. Today, if you wanted to fly from Edmonton all the way to Inuvik, it's about $600. So it's about a tenth of the cost equivalent as to what it cost in 1929. And the $2.70 per pound freight is about $44.50 today. And the equivalent price to spend a pound parcel to Inuvik is about $20 a pound. So it's about half the cost. These are some photos from stops along the way in Fort McMurray. So AFL is a Fokker Super Universal with Western Canada Airways. In the back, ARH is a Fairchild FC2 with Dominion Explorers. AKI is the Watmay's favorite Belanca. And then AAL is their Lockheed Vega. The one on the right is a Super Universal. And Commercial Airways fleet ended up becoming known as the Red Armada. The Vega and all 3 Belancas were painted this kind of bright reddish-orange color. And we actually have a piece of AKI at the museum, which preserves the original color. So this is actually off of their aircraft. So this is the color that all of their Commercial Airways aircraft would have been painted. And this is a R.W. Bradford photo of another pacemaker with General Aviation Limited in 1933. So very similar color to commercial. So although the Depression starts hitting in 1930, when the Depression starts hitting in 1930, flying clubs across Canada start losing students, and flying hours overall decrease by about 10%. In Edmonton, on the other hand, hours go up by 60%. We are by far the busiest flying club in the entire country. We had 1,704 hours versus Toronto, which only had 1,311 hours. The flying club gets some Gypsy Maws, which are Maws with more powerful engines, bringing the total up to 5 aircraft. The one here, CBX, is a DH-60M, which is incorporating a welded steel fuselage. Meanwhile, in the United States, the Ford Reliability Tour, more properly called the National Air Tour for the Edsel B. Ford Reliability Trophy, was a series of aerial tours sponsored in part by Ford from 1925 to 1931. So Henry and Edsel Ford were shareholders in the Stout Engineering Company, and then they bought it outright, forming the Stout Metal Airplane division of the Ford Motor Company. And their early aircraft, this is the Stout 2AT Pullman became the featured plane for the Ford Air Transport Service out of Michigan. So in 1930, Edmonton is scheduled to receive a particularly exciting visitor, which is a Ford Trimotor. I don't know why this is advancing automatically. So this reliability air tour leaves Detroit, flies all across the United States, all across Canada, with stops in Winnipeg, Brandon, Regina, Moose Jaw, Saskatoon, North Battleford, Edmonton, Calgary, and Lethbridge. So it's very exciting. And Edmonton decides to throw a show to welcome this aircraft and anybody else that would like to come to Edmonton and put on a big air show. So the 1930 air show is Edmonton's first air show, and it's massive. So this is a crowd gathered in front of Hangar 1, and I don't have any estimates for the crowd, but it's particularly large. In addition to the Trimotor, there's aircraft from all across the country. Really faintly in the background, you can see AMW, which is a Fairchild KR-34. This was Department of National Defense Civil Aviation aircraft. So Howard Ingram was the civil controller, and he was flying all across Western Canada, inspecting airports, licensing, flying clubs, that kind of stuff. So that was kind of his personal aircraft. And then CBY in the back is also a Department of Defense Moth. So it was flying around and on its way to the Saskatoon Flying Club. So this is the crowd in front of the Ford Trimotor and 118th Ave on the right. Watmey was particularly excited by this Travel Air Type R mystery ship. They were wire-braced low-wing racing aircraft, and so particularly fast. And they are called the mystery ships because they were built entirely in secrecy. At the time, Edmonton's mayor was James Douglas, and he was significantly involved in organizing this air show. So the three officials here are James Douglas, Kenny Blatchford, who was the mayor that helped start the airport and who the airport was named after, and then somebody else that I don't know. Western Canada Airways starts bringing mail in on the Prairie Airmail circuit. Regular service starts in March of 1930. This was a pretty needed boost for keeping pilots employed because that economic crash that was triggered by the 1929 stock market crash was starting to have a pretty significant toll on the mining industry and its exploration efforts. And those really huge, expensive expeditions like the McAlpine expedition were really no longer financially feasible. The Prairie Airmail actually only lasted 2 years, from March of 1930 to March of 1932, when the government canceled it. But the route was Winnipeg, Regina, Moose Jaw, Medicine Hat, Calgary, each way, daily, except for Sundays, and then a side run from Regina to Edmonton. From Regina to Saskatoon to Edmonton on the same schedule. They changed it. The Winnipeg to Calgary leg included Lethbridge, and then the Regina to Edmonton route included North Battleford. So this is the Western Canada Airways aircraft in Edmonton, and again, with a huge crowd greeting it, bringing the mail. It wouldn't actually be until August of 1931 that a Calgary to Edmonton flight by Conway Farrell started direct intercity airmail service, which was first started by Catherine Stinson when she came to Edmonton in 1918. So because of this Calgary to Edmonton edition, the North Battleford to Edmonton loop was dropped. Unfortunately, Commercial Airways runs into problems. So Isaac Solway of the brokerage firm Solway Mills and Company was one of the financial backers of Commercial Airways. And the stock market crash hits him particularly hard. He's accused of financial fraud. He's arrested and sent to prison. It completely wrecks Commercial Airways finances just after they bought the 3 new Belancas. So fairly reluctantly, they end up merging Commercial Airways into Western Canada Airways. But they end up becoming part of something much bigger. And so James Richardson at the time, because of his worry of the economic downturn, the American takeovers that are looming, he really wants to expand Western Canada Airways. So he forms Canadian Airways and acquires a lot of smaller aircraft companies like Commercial Airways and really expands this into a very large regional airline. And this is 6 years before the founding of TransCanada Airlines, sorry. We'll get to that one in June. I'm going to finish this one with Willie Post. Willie Post was from Corinth, Texas. He moved to Oklahoma when he was 5. Saw his first aircraft in 1913 at the county fair and said, I want to do that. And he signs up for flying lessons in Kansas City. He ends up working as a personal pilot for a wealthy Oklahoman, an oilman named Powell Briscoe and F.C. Hall. In 1930, Hall buys a Lockheed Vega, and he names it the Winnie Mae in honor of his daughter. And he sponsors these record-setting flights. So with the Winnie Mae, Wiley Post won the National Air Race Derby from Los Angeles to Chicago. So there's a lot of photos of this aircraft around the world and throughout the United States. And he ends up inscribing the fuselage at the back with Los Angeles to Chicago, 9 hours, 8 minutes, 2 seconds, August 27th, 1930. The second place finishers finished that flight in 9 hours and 9 minutes and 4 seconds. So it was literally like a minute difference between the two. So this ended up earning Post a prize of $7,500, which is about $112,000 today. And in 1930, the record for flying around the world was not held by an aircraft, but by the Graf Zeppelin, which was an airship. So they decide we're going to use the Winnie Mae to try to break this record. So in June of 1931, Post and his Australian navigator, Harold Gatty, leave Roosevelt Field in New York in the Winnie Mae with a flight plan that's going to take them around the world. So they're going to stop in Canada, go up to the Soviet Union, cross the Soviet Union, Europe, and come back to New York. In Nome, or sorry, the other way around. In Nome, his propeller has to be repaired, and they come through Edmonton and then Cleveland before returning to Roosevelt Field. So they arrive in Edmonton on July 1st after traveling about 24,900 kilometers in 8 days and 15 hours and 51 minutes as part of the first successful aerial circumnavigation by a single-engine monoplane. So a crowd of about 2,000 to 3,000 people gathered at Blatchard Field, anxiously awaiting the signs of the Winnie Mae, and it is very, very late. So finally their efforts are spotted. They see the Vega bearing down on the airport. It's pouring rain. And although it was mid-afternoon, they had to light up the landing field with as many lights as they could find. The Vega missed the airport and then ended up turning around, found it, and they executed a perfect landing. Unfortunately, to get off the ground again, because of this heavy downpour, the runways, which weren't paved at the time, were a complete mess. The Vega had extra fuel, it needed a long runway to take off on, and the muddy field was basically completely unusable. So they talked to Jimmy Bell, who's the airport manager, and decided that it was literally impossible to take off. So city officials take them down to the Hotel McDonald. They are able to get a sound sleep. They're hoping that they can get off the next day. Next day, nope, it's still pouring rain. And they decide to fire up the engine anyway, get the aircraft going. It's too cold. The aircraft doesn't start. They're fraught with a lot of problems. Finally, they get the engine started, and they realize, we really need to get this aircraft off the ground and get back as soon as possible. But the airport was completely unusable. So they decided instead that, actually, there's a 6-lane road that is several thousand feet long next to the airport, which was Kingsway. So they knock the fence down, they haul the aircraft to Kingsway, and they take it off from Kingsway Avenue. So there's kind of an urban legend in Edmonton that Kingsway was actually used as a runway at some point. This is actually the only time. So it's Willie Post takes off from Kingsway and uses it as a runway. But other than that, Kingsway is not used as an airport. So they finally get off, and they take to the air for their final 2 legs of their historic flight. In 1933, he repeats his flight around the world, this time using an autopilot and a compass in place of a navigator, so he becomes the first to accomplish this circumnavigation feat alone. And of course, he stops in Edmonton in 1933 as well. Unfortunately, Willie Post died in 1935 in a plane crash, so his career was unfortunately fairly short. So next month in June, we're going to pick up with airlines. So as I mentioned, Western Canada Airlines forms Canadian Airways. They start expanding quite a bit, and they become this major regional airline in Canada. We also have a lot of smaller operations forming, especially in Edmonton. Lee Britnell, we're going to come back to him. He forms Mackenzie Air Service, Grant McConaughey, who we haven't talked about yet, forms his own aircraft company after his uncle decides to spare him from going to China as a pilot and buys him an aircraft to start his own aircraft company. Eventually, a lot of these are going to merge together, and then by the late 30s, we have the federal government forming Trans-Canada Airlines. And they end up using a lot of ideas from James Richardson and kind of steal his thunder a little bit. So it's kind of a juicy story, especially if you're into Western alienation and want to complain about the federal government a lot. It's a particularly interesting story.